So my goal and objective is to educate the people about the Determination of Death Act, which is a bad law, which is based on bad medicine, which is contrary to the truth.
The problem of today's culture is that euthanasia is rampant. We never thought we'd get there, but it is. One of the ways we got there, believe it or not, is this whole concept of brain death. Many paramedics, my daughter for one, would talk about what is a motorcycle accident or a motorcycle rider. They're a potential organ donor. It's like a joke that is said. But the whole issue of brain death is very interesting because it's actually not real death. If that startles you, wait till you hear from our next guest. He's a quite well-known neonatologist who has devoted now most of his life to fighting brain death, the false definition of death that has led to an industry of organ donation around the world. You're going to want to stay tuned to this episode of the John Henry Weston Show with Dr. Paul Byrne. Truth has a power of its own. It moves hearts and saves lives. It heals wounds and restores souls, but only if it is heard. That's why our enemies are working nonstop to suppress the truth. That's why LifeSite News is the most censored life, faith, and family news source in the world. They are working to keep you in the dark. They are working overtime to make you feel alone and forgotten. But God says, I will never forget you. God never leaves us without hope of victory. And LifeSite News will never stop sharing the truth that sets us free. We will tell the truth without fear. We will tell the truth without compromise. And as mainstream platforms silence us, we will build our own. That's why I'm pleased to announce the launch of the new LSNTV app, which can bring all of LifeSite News' top video content direct to your phone, tablet, computer, and TV so that you can bypass the censors and keep fighting with us for life, faith, family, and freedom. Don't be alone in the darkness. We've been canceled. Fight the cancellation. Download the app. Let's begin as we always do with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. So, Dr. Byrne, you went from a career, a beautiful career of working with the tiniest babies who are delivered early, and you've saved so many lives that way, and then got into this other area, which has sort of consumed so much of your life. How did that happen? Give us some of that story.
Well, first of all, to start with the part of it about neonatology, I started a special care nursery at Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis in 1963, when, in fact, every baby less than 1,500 grams, that's 3 pounds and 4 ounces, that had trouble with breathing, and many babies larger than that had trouble with breathing, died. It was 100% mortality. The fact of the matter is that that particular time, President Kennedy's baby, who was about 5 pounds, died. So there was no treatment. So we started in 63. I would say we really did not start to make advances until about 1970. Then what happened in my own life, we were at Cardinal Glennon Hospital. We were instrumental in developing ways to help babies breathe. We identified the need for magnesium and zinc and copper and nutrition, that kind of thing. And then a patient by the name of Joseph in 1975 was born prematurely and on a ventilator, and Joseph wouldn't move, wouldn't respond. And one of the doctors on our team said, let's do a brainwave test. So we did the brainwave test, and it was interpreted as consistent with cerebral death. And so I saw death on the report, and I looked at Joseph and I said, well, he's not dead. I called a neurologist. He said, well, repeat it, which we did in 48 hours, and it was unchanged. So I said, what do we do now? And he said, well, in some places they turn off ventilators. I said, well, I don't do that. I said, I treat patients. Some live, some die, but I just treat him. So I continued to treat Joseph. He did get off the ventilator. He did go to school. He got excellent grades in school. Eventually, he married, has 3 children. Because of Joseph, and I have to tell you, I think it took me several months till by that time Joseph was getting to be 5 or 6 months old. He continued to live, and I said, I better investigate this. So I started my investigation then, and what became clear is that brain death is not based on any kind of science. The science, as you know, is really discovering, for the most part, what God has done, but the scientists make some observation or postulation and then does more testing to verify it and goes from there. Well, the first, to put it in perspective, what occurred was, to lead up to the lack of science, so what occurred was they did a heart transplant in South Africa in December the 1st, 1967, and Christian Bernard, and that became commonly known, but what has not become common knowledge is 3 days later, they did a heart transplant in Brooklyn, New York. They cut the beating heart out of a 3-day-old baby who had a problem with the brain and transplanted it into an 18-day-old baby who had a problem with the heart. The end of their procedures, both babies were dead. It was illegal. It was immoral. And so to resolve this, they set up a committee at Harvard. In about 6 months, the Harvard committee reported, and the title of the report is A Definition of Irreversible Coma. Now, you can't be dead and in coma, no matter how you modify it. And so looking at that, a new way of declaring somebody dead, looking at that, how did they get there? Well, the way we make advances in medicine, sometimes they begin in the laboratory, sometimes they begin with experimentation on dogs or cats or rats. Brain death was invented without any kind of laboratory data, no basic science. In fact, the matter is, there was no patient data. It has only one reference to the article, and that reference was to Pope Pius XII. They quoted him out of context, but they omitted the quote from Pope Pius XII, which is very significant, which Pope Pius XII said, we are to presume that human life continues as long as vital functions are present, even when supported by artificial means. It goes from there to the next article known as the Minnesota criteria, studied only 9 patients, did brainwave testing on only 9 patients. 2 of the 9 still had evidence of brainwaves. And fact of the matter is, if you use the current gain that's required, 4 of the patients would have had brainwave activity. But their conclusion was that it's no longer required to do EEG or brainwave testing, and it was stricken from that. The largest study in the literature is known as the collaborative study, 503 patients. Well, what happened to those 503? 44 of them did not die. And then of those who did die, even just focusing on the brain, 10% had no pathology in the brain. And it goes from there. It is no science behind brain death. But more importantly, John Henry, is while we focus on these issues, the most important issues have to do with the difference between life and death. And we know what life is. You're a living person, I'm a living person. We can look at another person and know that life is there. Well, that life begins with creation, in the love that God has for us and in the love between husband and wife. There is a time when the person does not exist and now the person exists. That's creation. And we can know that life has begun at conception, and then that life is a continuum until death. And death is the event that separates life from death. So we know what life is. We know that death is something different. And so the focus ought to be on not declaring someone dead until they are in fact dead. And so what happens when the life separates from the body? We can focus on the cell. The basic unit of biology is cell, but it helps us to think, but the life of the person is in the whole person. Yes, it's in every cell too. But what happens is, and it happens in all living cells, what happens when the life leaves, then the enzymes are activated and they're within the cell itself to destruct autolysis. auto meaning self, lysis meaning disruption of the membrane. So autolysis. So it begins when the life ends. And we know that. And so far as the determination of death is concerned, cells, tissues are important. But what we should be doing is not declaring somebody dead until they are dead. What there is during life, there is a system of respiration, a system of circulation, and there is a nervous system to focus on the brain. So you see, during life, there's an interdependence of circulation, respiration, and the activities of the brain. So it's an interdependent functioning that maintains the physical unity of the body, but is only there because of the unity of the body and the soul. So at death, the soul separates, and what we're left with on earth are the remains. And that remains is manifest as destruction, disintegration. The first part is autolysis. As it continues on, there's further disintegration, decomposition, eventually decay. If we want to wait until the muscles show that destruction, we can wait until there is destruction in the muscles, and that's called rigor mortis, which occurs about 3 hours after there's no circulation. Now, we don't have to wait that long to call somebody dead, but we certainly should not be calling somebody dead who has circulation, respiration, normal color, digest food, get fever if they get sick, put out urine. And fact of the matter is, what I've just described is what brain death is like. In fact of the matter is, when they caught on them to take the organs, in 10 out of 10 patients studied at Johns Hopkins University, the heart rate went up and the blood pressure went up. That would not happen in a cadaver. So brain death is that kind of thing. John Henry, in the society in which we live, in many ways, we tend to be a trusting society. In recent times, because of other things that happened, COVID and the like, we've learned not to be quite so trusting, but we tend to be trusting in society. So the general public, I think, trust. They want to do good to help their fellow man. They think, well, if I'm dead, take my organs and all of that kind of stuff. But they have to get to the facts. And the fact of the matter is, God creates us. God creates each one of us as unique and unrepeatable and gives our organs to us. And God makes it so that we cannot transplant an organ to another person. Well, human beings have found a way to interfere with God, to interfere with God's natural way of rejecting one another's organs, interfering with that so organs can be transplanted. And it isn't that God didn't know how to interfere with the rejection process. He does it every time a mother is pregnant. The baby is foreign to her and she would reject it. So as soon as the mother gets pregnant, rejection process is interfered with, and it can be documented. It's been documented in multiple animals and human beings that already when there's just one cell, that's even before implantation, the early pregnancy factor is there, and that interferes with the immune mechanisms. The mother accepts that baby and her immune mechanisms are interfered with until she delivers. And as soon as she delivers, her immune mechanisms are back like they were otherwise. So God knew how to interfere with and knows how to interfere with the immune mechanism, but he doesn't. So human beings come along and find a way to do this. So our organs are created for our own self. Can they be, if you take something like a heart, every time a heart transplant is done, the surgeon opens the chest wide open, ties off or puts the blood vessels in such shape that they can go to someone else. All the while, and I show recordings of this sometimes when I give a talk, shows the beating heart with the chest opened up. The transplant surgeon then stops the beating heart and then lifts it out. So that heart, that person is very much alive when they wheel them into the operating room to get their heart. And what's left are the remains of someone after they take the heart and many other vital organs to transplant to someone else.
Okay. So what you said, that's a lot to take in. There's some really, really fascinating things. One of the things that probably many people don't know is that whenever you get an organ transplant, you have to, for the rest of your life, take anti-rejection drugs because the body fights the foreign entity, someone else's organ, and doesn't allow for that. Otherwise, the body would fight it and destroy it as a foreign entity, but doesn't because of these anti-rejection drugs. And then Dr. Byrne explained how in the case of new life, of conception, also a new life, a different body, but God makes it so that there's no rejection going on there because, as Dr. Byrne said, God is able to account for making this a different entity inside a body and having it not go naturally. Now, we've figured out a way to do this with anti-rejection drugs. I have so many things to ask you about. There's so many fascinating aspects of this, but one is that these anti-rejection drugs are very costly. There's very much a cost incentive in this whole organ donation business. We're going to get to the morality in a second, but the cost incentive is really there, both in terms of the transplant itself and in terms of the anti-rejection drugs, which go on forever. Is there not? If you can tell us about that.
Actually, what happens in organ transplant, the recipient of the organ exchanges one set of problems for another set of problems, which is different from what we're used to in surgery. If someone has abdominal pain and appendicitis, they get an operation and everything is great. It isn't that way. And yes, these things are important to understand about the rejection and anti-rejection drugs and things that the person who receives the organ goes through for the rest of their life. And it's important to identify with that also has an effect on all of us because, for instance, TB is more common than it used to be, and things happen that are in society that are interfering with the fighting of infection and those kind of things. It's a societal issue. Kidney transplant is another one that gets a lot of attention, but we do have a way to treat kidney failure with dialysis, but people can live for a long time. And what happens, John Henry, is that oftentimes human beings will take the easier way out as opposed to the moral way. If we just focus on the heart, for instance, well, heart transplant, as we've already described, some of it is involved there. Almost as sure as you and I are talking to each other, a heart would have already, artificial heart that would have already been developed. It's been developed, used in animals and that kind of thing. It functions very well. Very likely we'd have a heart if we hadn't given doctors a way to find the easy way, that is, get the organ from someone else who's alive. And yes, they get killed in the process, but that gets acceptable to some. Incidentally, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. $48 billion in 2020 was billed for organ transplants, of which doctors got $6 billion. And so many doctors, essentially all of the hospitals are involved in this, and it's organized by the federal government. But when it's like a lot of other things that are organized by the federal government or organized by anybody, it gets down to the individual persons and people that are participating. They know that when they cut on them, sometimes they have to give them a paralyzing agent so they don't move. They have to give them anesthetics so that the care of the patient, the one they're taking the organs from, is better. And John Henry, it's so sad because patients that are deficient in thyroid, like the little girl 11 years old in California that we're helping with now, deficient in thyroid, and her mother, her father, we begged for them to give her thyroid. She was deficient in thyroid. A lot of people know that thyroid's essential for living. She was deficient in thyroid. It took us more than a week to get them to give her a thyroid. If her parents would have said, yes, take her organs, she would have gotten thyroid immediately, because they give the thyroid to make the organs in better shape for the one they're going to give the organs to. And so many of these things, I suspect if ordinary people would know about them, perhaps they would think differently. I don't know. What you're doing in terms of sharing this information as you are now in many other ways, it helps to educate the people in terms of what's going on.
One of the things you said there, the fascinating aspect of the huge amount of money involved and the government's work within this sphere has, at least I can speak to Canada and America, has created teams of, you can call it sales agents for this. When someone is involved in an accident, particularly a young, healthy-ish person in a car or motorcycle accident, the family is like preyed upon by these professional salespeople who are trying to get them to sign a consent so that they can quickly garner the organs. Because this is sort of like a business. It's sold psychologically by telling the parents, well, you know, you lost your son or you lost your daughter, but at least they can make a contribution to the future and so on and so forth. And yet this is immoral, and they are signing the death warrants of their own children. One of the things I want to talk about, because I know this is something that people think of, they think to themselves, wow, but it's possible. You know how incredible it is that you can take someone's heart and put it into somebody else and connect all this. It's like a miracle. Isn't that then moral because the miracle of being able to do it? How would you respond?
Well, of course, that sounds good, but when somebody's a cadaver, it isn't so. There's no organs that you can transplant from a cadaver. And you don't need to be a too astute observer to know what happens when there is death. Obviously, anybody who's found a person who has died, or their pet, or they find a dead bird in the woods as they walk, it's clearly different. And that difference happens when the soul separates. And then immediately the destruction begins. It's called autolysis. And no one should be declared dead unless there is destruction of the major vital systems, the circulatory and respiratory system in the brain. No one should be declared dead unless there's destruction of those systems. What do they do in brain death? They have the law revolves around an absence of function, and so it's revolves around activity. If you don't have activity, then you're called dead. Like the little girl in California, 11 years old, goes into diabetes and coma, and the result of that, immediately they start focusing on calling her brain dead, but they can't do the formal test. They do the formal test, and she doesn't take a breath. You know, the formal test of taking away the ventilator called the apnea test. She doesn't breathe. They write on her chart that she's brain dead, but then they want to do another test. The mother, the father plead, beg. We do everything to keep them from doing the second one because the apnea test is a terrible, terrible test. They take away the ventilator for up to 10 minutes, and the patient must show they can take a breath, or that becomes the signal to cut out the beating heart. That little girl, they did the second one in spite of pleading not to do it, and she took a breath. She was called brain dead the first time, it could not call her brain dead the second time because she took a breath. And here we are 2 weeks later and going to go to court tomorrow, and the doctors in the hospital are wanting to do another one of these apnea tests, and this little girl shows much evidence of healing. But what happens is that once somebody has this declaration of brain death, the system is going to make them dead, because everybody who's called brain dead, the system makes them dead either by cutting out their vital organs, or if they can't breathe on their own, taking their life support away from them. That's why they say nobody's recovered from brain death. Nobody's going to recover when they have their beating heart cut out. They cut out the organs, then they always are dead. If they need their life support and take it away, it's so sad because on the surface, they pretend like they really want to do something, but underneath, there's all these things. John Henry, you mentioned about people in Canada hovering over to get the organs. In the United States, we have that, except we give them a nice name. We call them a designated requester. So the treating physician is not allowed to discuss organ transplants. The designated requester, who is often described as somebody who is dressed very nice, has a lot of charisma, gets a cup of coffee, befriends somebody in the family, and eventually gets them to say yes. And then, John Henry, I work with people all over the world. I say all over many, many places in the world. That includes Canada and includes England, more than once, someone has said, well, you have it so nice in the United States because we in Canada or we in England have socialized medicine. In the United States, at least in my opinion, we have socialized medicine also. In Canada, there's one pool of money. In the United States, there's three pools of money: the federal money, the state money, and then the private insurance company. All of the private insurance companies do exactly what the federal government says to do. So it's a form of socialized medicine. There's a little bit of input into it, but not really. This morning I go to physical therapy. It will stop pretty soon, no matter what, because there's a certain number of visits. It doesn't revolve. It's a similar kind of thing, but it's not quite so open as it is in Canada and England.
Hey, my friend, are you an experienced video editor who can also shoot with a camera? If so, then we've got a job for you right here at LifeSite News. We are looking for a full-time video editor / cinematographer to work with me in studio right here in Barry's Bay, Ontario, Canada, to help produce our flagship programs. We will also head out on the road to capture live events such as the March for Life. And if you remember that truckers demo, that was awesome. So other national events will be included. Do you want to try your hand at one of the most exciting places to work in the pro-freedom movement? Join the LifeSite News team to serve Christ and spread his truth on life, faith, family, and freedom. To apply, simply email your resume, demo reel, and cover letter to resumes@lifesitenews.com. Wages are competitive, and relocation package is included. May God bless you, and I hope to see you on the LifeSite News team. One of the counters I've heard to the argument for why, because this is so miraculous, isn't it good? Because doctors are able to do this thing, isn't it moral because they're able to? It's been compared to me before to in vitro fertilization. Seems miraculous, seems like you have life and conception where there couldn't be. And yet it is, while being a fantastical type of thing, is completely immoral. It's outside of God's plan for procreation. And so similarly, even though it does seem rather miraculous what they can do, what science has advanced to, what physicians can do, surgeons can do, it's still immoral. This is not real death, it's brain death, a category created so that they could do these things. Even though it's quote unquote helping people, where some people get help, they are helped, but also they have to take these anti-rejection drugs, which costs a lot. But imagine too, you can help poor people by stealing from other people, robbing them or whatever, but that doesn't make it right either. So the morality here is not a case of morality because you can do this seemingly wonderful thing. That doesn't make it moral. Let's talk for a little bit about what happens with brain death and after the fact. We've had these designations where people have been on the list to go for brain death, but then woken up out of their designation, but prior to extraction surgery, which would have killed them for sure.
Well, that's been around for a long time, John Henry. A couple of things early on when I started to investigate, there was a patient who had flat brainwaves for 39 days and then woke up. In Madison, Wisconsin, there was a man, Mr. Wintergron, who was declared brain dead, and as they started to do something to take his eyes, he blinked. And so there were always from the beginning, it's that way. But, the doctors who declare death, they said, well, they're always dead when they do it. Well, we have a few examples of what happens. An outstanding example is Jahai McMath, a lot of notoriety, a 13-year-old girl in California who had tonsil surgery and then was said to be brain dead. And her mother got on the TV, is actually in the same room where I'm sitting now. Her mother was on the TV and pleaded, well, is there anyone out there that will help him? My son was right next to me and he poked me and he said, well, Dad, what are you going to do? So I went to California and they wouldn't let any doctors in to see her. So the way I got in was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and her stepfather, with guard in between, her stepfather said, "Oh, pastor, come on in here." That's how I get into to see her. They wouldn't call her by name. They referred to her as a dead body. They gave her no nutrition for a month, no nutrition. And so we got involved, and she was deficient in thyroid, and we found a way to give her that and get her started on that while she was still in California to get out of that hospital. Incidentally, she had a death certificate in California. She had all the tests for brain death. She had 3 treating physicians who said she was brain dead. The court appointed another expert from Stanford who came along and confirmed that she was brain dead. Got her transferred to New Jersey, where they gave her treatment that she needed. In a few months, she was transferred out to an apartment where her family took care of her. New Jersey, I went to see her, and her mother would say, "Give me a thumbs up." And after a little bit, her thumb would come up, "Raise your left leg," and the same thing would happen. So while she was declared brain dead, because of God and her mother and a few other people, she wasn't killed, as currently happens in people who are called brain dead. They're all alive. Their life gets ended. And if it's purposely ended by cutting out their vital organs, that's serious matter. If it's a question about whether the treatment is extraordinary means and the obligation to do it, that's another question. But if they do need the ventilator, as Jahai McMath did need the ventilator, she did. Anybody who's on a ventilator for about 2, maybe 3 weeks and has an endotracheal tube, that they cannot get out of an ICU unless they get a tracheostomy. The girl in California, she needs a tracheostomy, but they won't do it. A tracheostomy is to put a tube through the throat. So instead of the long tube that goes through the mouth, it's a short tube. And it makes it much easier for the patient to breathe through the one through the neck. Ada Nalu in Nevada, which incidentally, her case went to the Supreme Court in Nevada. We got a 7-0 unanimous ruling that the court could not accept what they were calling as brain dead and sent it back to a lower court. But in that case, no doctor at that hospital in Nevada would do a tracheostomy. Another doctor in Nevada would come and do it, but the hospital wouldn't allow them to do it. Treating the ear, nose, and throat doctor who was capable of doing it on the phone, he was practically in tears with me, saying, "I want to do it, but I can't take the pressure from my peers." And so it's a whole team of people that are all participating in this multi-billion-dollar industry, which depends on getting healthy organs, not damaged organs. So healthy organs, and where do you get healthy organs from? Living persons. Can you get a healthy organ from a cadaver? No.
What's truly stunning is the Chinese have this huge market in organs because they're able to do so with their prisoners, that they conveniently can get them to donate their organs very freely. Here, it seems in America and Canada and Europe, they've had to develop all these psychological means. You put the whole country under a scientific and moral and basically propaganda to be able to engage in this industry, this multi-billion-dollar industry. Absolutely stunning. But this has personal implications for people because one of the things that they're confronted with, the first and foremost, is for most people on their driver's licenses, when they get their driver's license, they're asked to sign consent for organ donation. How's that going today?
Want to be an organ donor, and they don't give them any information. On the spur of the moment, and I really think that people feel like, well, if I'm dead, take my organs, that kind of thing. And so they say yes to that. But signing that organ donor permit at the license bureau, that gives license to the transplant surgeon to kill you. No one should be saying yes at the license bureau. Everyone should be saying no. At least gather some information before you do that. In medicine, the distributing of information and giving information enough to make a decision, we call that informed consent. And so a person has to have information in order to consent or decline. At the License Bureau, they're not giving any information, and whether they consent or decline, they're doing it without information. Information is important, like education, John Henry, but in order for me to educate, I am dependent on people like you to disseminate the information. There are other organizations that are very active, even organizations that have, as far as people know, good reputations, that have been supportive of brain death and organ transplant, still supportive of it. And so it's the law is such that it's not a good law, can be declared dead when you're alive. But you see, the law is there. The law is dependent on the findings of medicine. We call that criteria to make a judgment. But the law in the medicine ought not to contradict the philosophy. The philosophy of living things has to do with the soul and the human person. There is a unity of the body and the soul. The soul has powers, of which obviously the intellective power is a major part. But there's still the nutritive power, as there is these people digest their food, the locomotive, they have circulation. These are powers of the soul. These are powers of being alive. So all of these people that are called brain dead, it's contrary to science to call them dead. It's contrary to philosophy to call them dead. But it's intertwined. And then John Henry, to think about them, it's like a lot of other things in life. In order to think about them, us human beings, because we tend to think about one thing at a time, we have to separate them out. But while we're separating them out, we get them mixed up. And so we mix up the philosophy, the law, the medicine, the tests that are done. They get mixed up. And then in some ways, we have some feelings or emotions, say, I want to help somebody else. And yet some other way we know that you're not dead when the heart's beating in their circulation. And then the philosophy gets there. And then we human beings, sometimes we give in when we shouldn't. And so what does the general public rely on? The general public relies on the leadership of the doctors, the leadership of the law, the leadership of the philosophers and the theologians. So far as the law is concerned, right now, and one of the most important things, and we are embarking on a project called Project Truth, and that is to educate about the law about determination of death. It has two ways. It's either one or two. You're only dead one way. And the focus is on cessation of brain function, but cessation of function is not enough. Even if you put words in front of it like irreversible, it's a cessation of the brain activity. That is not enough. It has to be more than that. That's the number two way in the law. But the number one way in the law is used because they can't use the number two way, because they have clear evidence of a functioning brain, but they still want their organ. So what they do is they take away their life support, and then they don't take it away long enough for someone to be dead. They take it away long enough so they don't have a pulse. That is, so they don't have circulation enough to detect a pulse. And then they call them heart dead, and then they start everything else up. And then to ensure that they can't ever have a functioning brain, they cut the carotid arteries off to make sure they don't become conscious as they're doing their procedures. All of this stuff is evil. So my goal and objective is to educate the people about the Determination of Death Act, which is a bad law, which is based on bad medicine, which is contrary to the truth, and then to have a good law. And we do have a good law. Good law says no one shall be declared dead unless the circulatory and respiratory systems and the entire brain have been destroyed. It's a good law. It works good. It protects the life of the person, which is the standard of law should be across the board generally, that it shouldn't be just there for some religion, whatever that is, that kind of thing, or some Russian race, or some other thing, some how much money, whatever it is. The law, so far as life and death is concerned, is the same for everybody, no matter what it is. We are alive from our creation, each person is, and what do we do as human beings? Because God loves us and we love God, we love other human beings and we protect and preserve the life of that. And once the creation is there, then preservation has to be there. And preservation includes the circulation and respiration and other things that have to happen. And then when the soul separates, what you have left is destruction. The only question is, how much destruction do you have to have before you declare them dead? Well, it's absolutely foolish to call them dead when they're digesting food and putting out urine and that kind of thing. Anybody who can think a little bit knows that that's not death.
Indeed. Dr. Byrne, thank you so much for that. Where can people go for more information, particularly if they want to see what is going on with brain death, to get themselves a power of attorney, which gives them protection so that they don't have their organs taken, or that their loved ones are protected?
Yes, where they can go two ways, at least two, but one is www.lifeguardianfoundation.org. We have information there. Incidentally, we send out cards, and you can sign the card saying you don't want to be an organ donor. But what is more important on that card, it says you want to be treated. You want to be treated. If you get into the system, you want to be treated, so you can get that card. The other thing that is going on there are two books that are available. One is by Heidi Classic, The Fallacies of Brain Death. It's very, very important. And there is a book that's been written about me, my name, and Defender of Life. It's not my cup of tea to do much about propagating my own self. Over the years, I've been asked, and I've never had time. Christopher Bogosh, intensive care nurse, wanted to write it, so he wrote it. But the purpose of the book is not me. The purpose of the book is to educate that the laws about death are bad in the United States. They're bad in all the states, and they must be repealed, and they must be replaced with a law that will protect the life of the person until death. And so we're on Project Truth. We need people. We will take them from every state and any state. The goal and objective is to educate people, and then they educate the legislators, get the bill introduced into the legislature, and then it will be discussed. That in some ways, that's how we are to where we are right now, because they wanted to revise the Determination of Death Act to make it even less strict. That brought attention to everybody. This discussion that you and I are having, I started these discussions 40 years ago. And so in some ways, they're really not any different. And sometimes I go back to my early writing and I say, wow, I was saying it already then. I mean it only that way in humility, because the truth doesn't change, John Henry. The truth is there, the truth about life and death, and the truth has to do with creation by God, not evolution. That's all nonsense. And so creation by God, the life of the person, is a unity of the body and soul. It's a continuum until death. Death is the event that separates the body and soul, and what you have left on earth are the remains, which is manifest as destruction, disintegration, dissolution.
Dr. Paul Byrne, thank you so very much. You won't do it, but I will. I would recommend everyone go get the book, Dr. Paul Byrne, Defender of Life. Go to the website also, lifeguardianfoundation.com. Get it there. Dr. Byrne, on behalf of all of our LifeSite crew, thank you for being a staunch defender of life and a defender of the faith and the family. May God bless you.
Thank you very much. You too, John Henry.
And God bless all of you. And we'll see you next time. Hi, everyone. This is John Henry Weston. We hope you enjoyed this program. To see more like it, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to get all the latest content from LifeSite News. Check the links in the description to read more and connect with us on social media so that you can stay up to date with all the latest life, family, faith, and freedom news. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you.